Okay. This is being recorded on Monday, October 23rd, the 17th day of Israel's war with Hamas, which we cannot forget how it began. The utter brutality and barbarism that the Hamas terrorists displayed will never be forgotten. And that's what I want to talk about today, because the brutality will never be forgotten by Israel and by Jews around the world. But it has already been forgotten, or it has at least receded onto the back burner in most of the Western world. And that, um, the fact that the Western world has forgotten already about the brutality, despite the unusual efforts of the IDF, Israel's Defense Forces, to take journalists into the towns and kibbutzim in which slaughter had occurred, and where Israeli bodies were still on the ground. That unusual step, because Israel had never done that before, as far as I can recall. Despite that unusual step, Western world still is focused instead on crying Palestinian children and women. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm saying that when you go on, so this is what I do to look for news every day about what's going on in the conflict, in the war, in the war. See, I even reduced, I allowed myself to use the language that the media is using, calling it a conflict. It's a war between morality and barbarism, a war for Israel's peace and security. So the news that I look at every day is New York Times, not because I necessarily agree with everything the New York Times says, but because it's by default the premier news outlet in America. So I go there. I also like to read the op-eds, or what they call now guest essays, uh, because they have guest essays mainly from people center left, but also sometimes center right. I also like to read Times of Israel, and I've been reading lately, I haven't subscribed to it yet, Bari Weiss, her website called The Free Press. Bari Weiss used to be a columnist, an op-ed writer, contributing editor, whatever they call it, for the New York Times. But she left, and she started her own website. And that, if you want something that is very pro-Israel at right now, look for the Free Press. A lot of it you can read for free, but you have to subscribe if you want to read everything on it. And I haven't subscribed yet. You can also subscribe to Daniel Gordis, Inside Israel. I like to read his. Often, a lot, you can get an email from him. Just look for Inside Israel, Daniel Gordis. So Daniel Gordis is a PhD author. He's a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary, so he is a rabbi, but he never served as a rabbi. He's an academic through and through, made Aliyah about 30 years ago, writes very powerfully and articulately about what's going on in Israel. So if you like what I have to say about Israel, then you'll like Bari Weiss and you'll like Daniel Gordis. Um, So sometimes I also look at Haaretz. That tends to be more left. But in this time, one thing we need to understand, when Israel's under attack, there is no more left and right in Israel. Okay, that is clear. It's clear now that most Israelis are upset with Netanyahu, but no Israeli is protesting against Netanyahu and the government right now because everyone, left and right, agree in Israel that the priority right now is to bring the hostages home, if they can, and to defeat Hamas. Okay, that's number one. So there is no left and right. So Haaretz might have some op-eds in it that might say anti-Netanyahu, Netanyahu has to take the blame and all that, but in their articles and everything, all pro-Israel and pro-war, as it always has been in the history of Israel. Left and right falls by the wayside. People fight together, stand together for Israel. So please excuse this diatribe, but here I want to get back on the focus. What I wanted to focus on today, last Monday's Jews in the News was just about the barbarity of Hamas and the difference between the barbarism there and Israel's morality and the morality of the army. Okay, so I spoke about that. And then, but that was a day before the hospital was bombed in Gaza. So I want to talk about that, and that will lead me to talk about further aspects of this, the sentiment of media and especially social media today against Israel. So when that hospital was bombed, immediately, Hamas blamed Israel, and immediately the New York Times published on its website how Hamas blames Israel for that attack. And it wasn't until 2 hours later that the New York Times changed how it reported and what it had on its website. And you have to look for it. The New York Times retracted and didn't apologize, but tried to explain how this happened and why and what safeguards the New York Times will have in place to be sure it never happened again. It was a half-hearted apology. If you can find an editor's note or something like that on a New York Times website, it'll say the rush of breaking news. Really, they were using that as the excuse for why they published Hamas's claim and did not wait for full corroboration. So it was clear. So, okay, let me say, it was clear to me that because I know, well, okay, let me say it this way. At heart, I am pro-Israel. And so therefore, I will, if I have news from Israel or from Hamas to weigh, I will always side with Israel's version, even though I know that Israel can be wrong and has made mistakes and doesn't always admit to its mistakes. But despite that, I will always listen to Israel first. But on top of that, I will listen to Israel first, especially when it comes to Israel versus news that Hamas reports. Because as I said last week, Hamas's aim is to destroy Israel, number one. And Hamas represents an aspect of Arab culture that extols uh, and um, and raises up um, cruelty for the sake of victory. And so there were a ton, and I didn't see it because I don't go there on social media, but there were a ton of videos posted by the terrorists themselves who had body cameras on themselves, and then took the step of finding the social media posts of the hostages themselves and posted videos on the Israeli hostages' own Facebook or Instagram or TikTok feeds. So there's a ton of video showing Hamas's brutality and evil and unspeakable crimes that they committed. And that's bad. What's worse is that the Palestinians in the street were coming out and cheering what they were doing. And pro-Palestinian rallies are still being held in which they are also praising the cruelty of Hamas. Okay, so that's why I will never listen to Hamas's version of news, never ever, and always will discount it. The fact that the New York Times was willing to publish, not just listen and not just take seriously, but to publish the news from Hamas as if it's fact, just highlights the real problem that Israel faces in terms of getting sympathy from the world to its cause. A lot of people over Israel's 75 years have said, what does Israel have to do to try to gain sympathy? Why is it that the Palestinians have always been able to be able to gain sympathy from the world and Israel hasn't, when on paper Israel has more right on its side than the Palestinians do? So there are a couple of things here. I took notes to myself to try to focus my presentation today, and feel free to interrupt with a question or comment at any time, as always. So one issue is the narrative. That is, what is the story that people tell and retell about the creation of the state of Israel, right? The Jewish story, of course, is that Jews were exiled by the Romans 2,000 years ago from the land of Israel, from our homeland, right? Jews have lived in the land of Israel, if you believe the Torah, since this week's Torah portion of Lech Lecha. So if Abraham and Sarah are truly historic figures, then we have been living in the land of Israel since 1600, 1500 BCE. All right, so 3,500 years, something like that. But historically speaking, we have been there. I mean, you can prove it archaeologically to the time of the first temple. So we've been there 3,000 years. Okay, not 3,500, 3,000. You can prove it historically, right? You can prove that the temple stood in Jerusalem. You can prove that King David existed. Okay, that you can prove. So 3,000 years Jews have been in Israel. Okay, so that's part one of our narrative, right? We've been there. We were exiled from our land. There are still Jews there, but we were, the bulk of the population was exiled 2,000 years ago by the Romans. But we've always been there. And we've always prayed 3 times a day for returning to Israel. And so when the opportunity presented itself in the 1890s by Theodor Herzl and the World Zionist Congress that he convened to try to establish a state in Israel, the opportunity presented itself, and as we know, 50 years later, the state of Israel came about. But it came about in May 15th, 1948, as a result of a vote of the United Nations in the end of November of 1947, where the United Nations voted to allow the creation of both an Arab and a Jewish state in the land of Israel, an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Jewish narrative continues in that as soon as the state of Israel was declared, well, first of all, the Arabs rejected the Jewish state part of the United Nations declaration of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. As soon as the state of Israel was established by David Ben-Gurion and what essentially became the first Knesset, the Arab states around Israel attacked, convincing the Arabs in Israel to escape, to flee, by saying, don't worry, we're going to push the Jews into the sea and they'll go back home again. Right? So the Jewish narrative, the story that we tell, which is based in fact, is this is what the Arab nations did to create the refugee issue. Okay? Now, was Israel involved in encouraging the Arabs to flee? Absolutely. Were the Arab states involved in encouraging the Arabs, the indigenous Arabs of the land of Israel to flee? Absolutely. Calling those Arabs Palestinians only happened in the 60s when Yasser Arafat created the Palestine Liberation Organization. They were not called Palestinians before. The land of Israel was called Palestine by the Romans. And because the Romans called it Palestine, historians kept calling the land Palestine. But an interesting thing that I just read last week is the interesting thing in Hebrew, there is a P sound, right? The letter Pei. So we make the P sound in Hebrew. Arabic, which is also a Semitic language, very closely related to Hebrew, does not have a P sound. Does not have a P sound. All right, so for the Arabs to say that they are Palestinians, it's impossible for them to say that linguistically. So all right, so just keep that in mind, okay? Now, so that's the Israeli narrative, that's the Jewish narrative that we tell. But the narrative that most of the world thinks is true is that Jews came to Israel, to the land of Israel, that Jews came to Palestine in order to colonize Palestine. Now, the Jews who came to Israel were mostly from European countries. So the irony of ironies is the Jew is the colonizer because colonizers are white. And white Europeans went to America and colonized America, right? So please excuse how I'm kind of, my mind is going wide range here, but it's all within the structure of reaction to the bombing of the hospital in Gaza. So the introduction to our program last Thursday night at the Sandy Spring Museum, which inaugurated our participation in the ADL Kulanu project, where synagogues agree to try to find partners in the non-Jewish world to combat anti-Semitism. So we were partnering with the Sandy Spring Museum, showed the movie that was on Thursday, October 12th. We showed the movie of Repairing the World, Stories of Tree of Life. Right? The introduction that Sandy Spring gave for the evening included its pat statement, in which they wanted to recognize, and this is what a lot of theaters do now, whether they say it out loud or it's printed in the playbill, to recognize that the land that the theater is on is Native American land, and these are the tribes that were had lived there before the whites came and took it over. Okay, so you have that. So what is that? All that? Okay, so all right. So we recognize that yes, we are here in America today because the Pilgrims came and took over the land, brought smallpox with them, which decimated the Native American population, and then killed or drove the rest away. And as America expanded, right, pushed the Native Americans onto reservations, right? Oversimplifying the whole history, but understanding, yes, America was a colonizing country. Does anybody ever, anybody say in America today, even from the left, do we need to give back Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City to the Native Americans? No, nobody is arguing that, but you feel better by saying we're on land that was originally Native American land. Okay, so you tug at some heartstrings there. Will it make any difference in our behavior? No. But so the white European colonizers came and drove out the savages, as they were called, these Native Americans who looked different, talked different, and believed different. They didn't know anything about the Bible, and therefore they were uncivilized, right? It's not just that they didn't know about Western thought, it's that they didn't know the Bible. And anybody who doesn't know the Bible is uncivilized, is a heretic, is not human. And to then say, right, which is why white Europeans hate the Jews, because we've never admitted or acclaimed, professed belief in Jesus as God. And until we do, we will be seen as other. Now we're other. We know the Bible, but we haven't accepted the whole Christian Bible. So there is still a hatred of the Jew that is ingrained in Christian Western society. It's absolutely clear to me that no matter how much Jews have accomplished in America, we are still seen as other. And it's clear to me with the exponential rise in anti-Semitic acts in America. It's clear it's still ingrained in Western culture and Western ideology. Christians are good, anybody else is not. Okay, so I just have to tell it like it is, and that's the way I see it. And that's the way I understand the place of the Jew in America and the place of Israel in Western society. Some will argue that, oh no, we're just against Israel, we're not against the Jews. That's baloney. Anybody, most of this venom that is being spewed on social media today, claiming to be anti-Israel, is also anti-Semitic. That's absolutely clear to me. So the hospital bombed on Tuesday, just over a week into the war, and how it was reported brings all of this to light to me, to show how short the memory of Western media is, and how quickly it will turn to the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian side, because of the narrative that has been promoted and reported and told over and over and over again. Western European Jews came into Arab land of Israel, colonized the land, pushed the Arabs out, and created the refugee problem. And then as the state of Israel was established, became colonizers themselves, occupiers, and an apartheid state. Discounting the terrorism perpetrated by Arabs against Israel, seeing it as a legitimate act of rebellion, and expressing how that's legitimate by refusing to call what the Hamas terrorists as terrorists. You go onto any website, any media today, it is rare that that any New York Times, anybody calls the Hamas armed terrorists as terrorists. They're called militants, they're called combatants, they're not called terrorists. Because if you call them terrorists, then you admit that what they're doing is illegal and not should not be praised, should not be accepted as a legitimate act of rebellion and protest. Calling them terrorists means that you disagree with them. Calling them militants, calling them combatants, says that you agree with their cause. Okay? So, how I don't know, because I'm not a political strategist, I'm not a marketing strategist. I have no idea how Israel can overcome that bias. I really have no idea. Despite the fact that Israel took the unorthodox means that it did by showing Western journalists exactly what Hamas did, despite that, there is no one in Western media today that is sympathetic to Israel's cause, right? Even President Biden, who said that understood and expressed very clearly that what Hamas did was wrong and they were terrorists, is still behind the scenes trying to get Israel not to complete the task. Completing the task of eradicating Hamas means because Hamas will not protect its own fellow citizens, will not protect its fellow Arab countrymen. Because of that, Israel will undoubtedly, and has already, because of its airstrikes, killed civilians. Now, Israel's aim is not to kill civilians, but that doesn't matter to the Western media. What matters is getting pictures of toppled buildings, of destruction, of video of crying women and children. And that, it doesn't matter to them who caused the children to cry, and that Hamas arranges itself in such a way that Israel has no choice but in trying to kill Hamas commanders and terrorists, that civilians will be killed. For the Western media and pundits in Western media, it's all Israel's fault, and it is going above and beyond what Israel should be doing in retaliation. So it is also clear to me that when we argue morality, as I said in Yom Kippur, there is no black and white when we talk about moral issues. That every moral issue has an element of gray in it. And therefore, depending on where we fall in our own, as we derive our own moral code, that moral code helps us navigate through the gray area, because life is gray. Life is not black and white. Life is gray. So any moral, ethical decision we make involves how we feel most comfortable in the gray. Okay, so as an example, like I talked about last week, whether it's end of life issues, whether it's beginning of life issues, these are not black and white issues. There's a lot of gray. And so someone who is terminally ill, and doctors have said that there is absolutely no more hope for this person, any other medical measures would be actually worse for the patient because they are terminal than to let the person be. That in itself is a decision that the family has to make. That is a no-win situation, because a family member of someone who is terminal knows that their family member is going to die. And you want to do everything you can to keep that person alive, but at the same time, you want to allow that person to die in peace and in dignity. And what does the whole idea, the phrase quality of life mean? So there is no black and white definition of what quality of life is. We have general idea, we have a general religious, moral, and ethical definition that we come up with of what quality of life is, but that is only a general definition. It doesn't apply to you specifically. We, your family members, we have to figure out, based on the general principles, how to apply that to your specific situation. So the general principles that the Israeli army works on is this idea, this what seems to be a hypocritical phrase, tohar haneshek, the purity of ammunition, purity of arms, purity meaning the morality of the use of ammunition. So that doesn't seem to make sense. Use of ammunition seems to be cruel. How can the use of it be moral? Right? So that again relates to last week when I said that the sixth commandment specifically says, lo tirtzach, do not murder. It does not say lo taharog, do not kill. It says do not murder. So that in and of itself is eye-opening for many people in the Western world, because most people in the Western world raised in the Christian world, whether they're believers or not, still were raised with a Christian translation of the Bible, which says, thou shalt not kill. And it takes a lot for someone to say, this is my moral definition of life and death. You have a different definition of life and death, and even takes more courage to say, I think I'm right, and I think you're right. It is rare for someone to have the courage to say, I'm right, my moral definition of life and death is right, but I also think that your moral definition of life and death is right. I don't subscribe to it, but I think you're right. How many people do we know, especially in this age of social media and civil discourse, which has run amok, and anybody can say anything, and oftentimes it can be seen as truth, in air quotes? How, in this climate, to say I'm right, you're right, do we ever see that in social media? Never. So this will make Israel's position that much more difficult to get across, right? So it's only those, that is Jews, and that not all of the Jews in the world are pro-Israel. It's only the Jews who have Israel's back. And I would say right now, it's mostly Israeli Jews that have Israel's back, and Jews in America, a lot of them, not all of them, and other Jews around the world who have an even more difficult time to be able to have a pro-Israel rally without being afraid for their life in attending that rally. So, so I have gone far afield here, and I hope I have given a little bit of background as to why the Western media fell in line with Hamas and the Palestinian story quickly and unreservedly, as opposed to waiting and getting Israel's side of the story. Because when it comes down to it, for many people, Israel does not have legitimacy. And because they are seen to be occupiers, colonizers, invaders in that territory, the land of Israel, that we don't belong there. And why don't we belong there? Because we're Jews. And where do Jews belong? Jews belong where the majority populations say they belong. Okay, so I am being very pessimistic. I'm being very dismal in that assessment, but I can't help it because of how Jews, what has happened to Jews in the past 2,000 years in Western history, and how our time, where we think it's different because we're living in America, it's not different. It's just a different gradation, different aspect of the same story. The Jew is other. The Jew can't have any rights because we didn't give them any rights, and we need to keep them in line. And that's it's become clear to me that even despite my kind of safe life here, taking my life in America for granted, But being a student of history, knowing that we always, as Jews, have to be looking over our shoulder and um, and we need Israel to be a safe haven where the Jews during the time of the Crusades had no place to go. The Jews during the pogroms in Europe had no place to go. The Jews in the concentration camps had no place to go. We need that place, and we know that Israel will always be and conduct itself um, to the utmost morality and ethical standards, moral and ethical standards. Israel will always do that. And we need, as much as we can, to advocate on Israel's behalf. We know it's an uphill battle. It's like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain. It's an endless, but we have no choice to do it project, um, because if we don't stand up for Israel, nobody else will. And the Western memory is very short. Any questions or comments? Saul first, and then Perry.
Okay, I have a lot.
Okay.
First of all, I just want to mention that if you watch JBS, which is a Jewish broadcasting system, it's on Verizon. I don't know about the other.
Yes.
They have regularly Daniel Gordis and Barry
Yeah.
Weiss on, and you can hear our side if
Yes.
you want to continually hear our side.
That's good. So that's another good. So I just want to pause just for a second, just to say that yes, if you want to watch on, besides reading, there's watching Jewish broadcast service or system. If your cable service provides it, if you still have cable, look for it. And yes, that'll be something else that will make you feel better, and read something that you know has been corroborated and is true. Go ahead, Saul.
So, we know the history of the Jews, but a lot of people don't know the history of Jews. And like
Oh,
even non-Jews who reach out to me, they don't understand any of this. But I do know this, that the world has heard about all the killings of Jews, whatever they know, over the
yes,
years. But they see that the Jews, at least in America and maybe Europe, are very successful.
right,
They see the doctors, they may hate their doctor, but they want a Jewish doctor.
right,
The lawyers, the accountants, the teachers, the media, Jews have been successful and all that. And they see the success of Jews and they think, well, what are they complaining about? You know, and a lot of people don't know our history. And this is a problem that I've thought about a long time is, even Jews own marketing companies and they've reached out to help Israel. I've read about it,
uh-huh,
in the New York
right, over
Times,
the years,
but they
right,
can't come up with a campaign.
right,
And and I don't quite buy your argument about the Jews or the other because the Muslims are the other also.
right.
So, I mean, why do they treat us
Okay.
different than the Muslims, even though the Muslims don't believe in Jesus Christ?
Right. So there's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in America today. Just look at that 71-year-old landlord in the Chicago suburbs last week who slaughtered that 6-year-old boy and stabbed repeatedly that boy's mother. There's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, especially after 9/11, right? I will say, and again, I'm not a historian. I'm not a political strategist. There are a lot more Muslims in the world than there are Jews. Okay, a lot more Arabs in the world than there are Jews. And what I was thinking about while you were saying about, why can't Israel get its story out? They have all these marketers. Just looking at um, every now and then, the media will present pictures in the paper of Palestinian civilians suffering, crying, right? And Israelis crying. But if you look at the picture, what does the picture present? The Palestinian civilians crying are in front of, always presented in front of destroyed apartment buildings. So they're standing in front of rubble, and there's the sound of bullets behind them, and you have like these poor looking Palestinians suffering. And then, to your point, Saul, you have the rich Jew suffering. What does the rich Jew look like? The rich Jew suffering doesn't have dust on their face like the poor Palestinian has dust on their face in the picture or in the video feed, right? That's what it's like last night watching the news. I always watch the half hour repeat of the ABC News, and right, they interview a mother of one of the 222 hostages, and she's dressed. You know, her hair is done nicely. She's wearing makeup, and she's dressed just like you and me. But against that is a report from Gaza with the humanitarian aid coming in, and the Palestinian women and children sitting with dust on them in front of destroyed buildings. So it's a subtle, yet I think very important point that I think brings, if I, right, I was never an art history person, and I have to read about what art historians say about art because I can't always see it myself in the work of art, right? Understanding what the artist is trying to convey, and just the light in the painting, or how people look in the painting. But enough of reading it lets me see the stark contrast that I think the media intentionally is portraying, that the Jew isn't really suffering as much as the Palestinian is, right? And that's a harder thing. That's also that subtle point that the Jew doesn't look like he or she is suffering, so they must not be. But the Palestinian is suffering now, and so that's where the sympathy lies. It's awful, and I think that there are, like Barry Weiss and the Free Press is trying to bring that out, but it's not the New York Times, so people aren't reading it, and it's not popular on social media, so people aren't reading that either. Perry, what were you going to ask or say?
Your presentation just elicited so many old thoughts, and interestingly enough, Saul hit on a few of them, but I'll take them a little further.
Yeah.
First of all, and I'm not in any way accusing you of plagiarism,
Yeah.
it felt like I was getting a small recap of Dershowis's book of A Case for Israel.
Okay, yeah. I mean, there are books out there. I actually haven't read that book, but yeah, I mean, the case for Israel. I'll let you continue in a moment.
Okay.
I was brought up in Jewish day school almost my entire life. Went into a Jewish profession, so I know, because I've read and I know the Jewish side of the story. Okay, so Alan Dershowitz, I think he went to Yeshiva Flatbush in Brooklyn. So he has the same education that I do, except he went to law school and not rabbinical school. So yes, that story, which we see as fact, is out there. And yes, the But again, it all depends. This is with everything. It all depends on who you want to read and who you want to believe. But that gets to the bigger question of why we want to believe, why the West wants to believe the Palestinian narrative and does not want to believe the Jewish Israeli narrative. That's the question. But go ahead.
Interesting. In Dershowitz's book, he spends at least one chapter, and you can read that book by chapter, any place
Yeah.
you want.
Yeah.
He spends a lot of time pointing out that the Jews and the Arabs all were living in Palestine for years and years and years and
Yes.
years. So it wasn't an Arab country.
Right.
And I think he also points out that the Palestinians was a made up, which you
Yes.
explained. Sal also hit on a point that always humors me about Jewish success. When the Arab countries, and I forget which one led it, said they were going to boycott everything to do with Jews. Of course, they continue to see their doctors to get vaccines developed by us. The Saudis were still coming to Israeli hospitals and having surgeries,
Right.
and all that kind of stuff. So
Right.
that's a dichotomy. By
And
the way,
Hamas even allows some of their children to go into
Right.
Israel to be operated on in Israeli hospitals. Yes.
So Sal also hit on another thing which immediately occurred to me when you started speaking about why don't we have this mass marketing campaign
Yeah.
in favor of Judaism in Israel? Of course, we all know that none of the Arab countries have stepped up to help the so-called Palestinians now. And in fact, and I forget which part of history it was, but it was the Egyptians, I think, that put those Arabs on Cyprus for a long time and kept
No, it
them-
was British. It was the British mandate. So
Okay,
so-called illegal immigration
right.
of Jews. So the British were in charge of what they called Palestine from after World War I, so 1919 until May 14th, 1948. Okay, that was the end of the British mandate. So during that time, there were a number of what were called white papers. The British government would send somebody to take a look at what was going on in Palestine and then report as to how best to deal with the Arab violence against the Jews. There were a number of pogroms of Arabs against Jews in British Mandate Palestine. And so there were several white papers during that's just what it was called, from 1919 to 1948, in which they limited and then more limited Jewish immigration, that
Oh yeah.
legal British Jewish immigration to Palestine. So there was a quota. So you could get, theoretically, as a Jew in Europe or anywhere, go to a British embassy or consulate, ask for a visa to live in British Mandate Palestine, and you're on a list for however many thousand that they would allow in. But of course, it wasn't enough. And so there was illegal immigration happening. So the Exodus is the most famous of them all, of these ships docked in Haifa, and then British Mandate Authority escorted it to Cyprus because all of them were illegal. They didn't have visas. They were above the quota that Britain randomly set to appease the Arab population.
You just reminded me of something else. I used to do some work with an attorney. His name was Steve Sarfati, and my client was Jewish. We never knew he was Jewish.
Right.
Where did the name Sarfati come from?
Right.
It was the name of the ship that his relatives landed in Israel on.
Interesting.
So
Sarfat in Hebrew is France. So
Oh.
Sarfati would be a Frenchman.
okay, so Saul, what station is that on Verizon?
Oh yeah, what?
On Verizon, it's $7.99.
$7.99.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah, I tell you. So, yeah. Bob, did you want to? Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, there's also I-24.
That's right.
And just so you know, we're overseas and we got it in Portugal. And it was in English as well as the local language. So we could watch it and we were watching everything on Tuesday night from there.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. So you have to know what to look at. So yeah, I don't watch TV that much really. So yeah, so I forget because I do have Verizon myself that I'm not sure I-24 is on Verizon, but JBS definitely is.
It is.
Oh, it is. Okay, so I have to look for that too.
Come on, you don't watch the Eagles and Phillies.
I was
huh?
saying Eagles and the Phillies. I just I thought
No,
the
you don't
same
watch
thing.
TV.
Okay. All right, you ratted me
76ers.
out. You ratted me out. Yes. Okay, but I have been distracted, fortunately, by my granddaughter this weekend and by the Phillies and the Eagles. And I felt guilty, actually. I laugh about it, but I feel guilty about being distracted because I should be thinking about Israel 24/7. And yeah, so a good way to support Israel is to go to the JBS and I-24. What would who's that? Oh yeah, just hell yeah. So yeah, so that's a good. Those are good ways to follow up on it too. So we're running out of time. I needed to talk about these issues to help us understand and emphasize Israel's side of the story, the morality of Israel's cause right now, and also that Israel itself is debating, right? It was on Times of Israel today that the army is just waiting for the cabinet to approve entering Gaza, right? So everybody's assuming that Israel's going to go in and start to killing civilians, but Israel has its democratic methods and government policies to uphold, and is just waiting for the cabinet to approve it. And why is the cabinet waiting? Perhaps understanding the political implications, which are despicable, that the world would be influencing Israel here. Because if Israel doesn't go in, it's all of this will be for naught. Israel has to get rid of Hamas once and for all. Israel has no choice. And I would say, despite what the world is saying to it, but Israel's needs the United States to have its back, and if the United States says to Israel, "We cannot back you going in," then Israel's between a rock and a hard place,
Yeah.
and it's left with terrible, terrible choice. Okay, so we're going to stop here for today. Thank you all for indulging me in another
Unmuted.
Jews in the News, and we'll see you all next week.
Right. Yasher Cole.